All right, so over about the last week or so, we have seen an absolute massive explosion in protests across the country of Iran that was initially sparked off with the killing of a young woman named Mahsa Amini by the Iranian morality police, which is a legitimate thing that they have in this country, for essentially not wearing what they deem to be the appropriate head covering. So I got a great breakdown here from Common Dreams' Julia Conley in terms of what sparked these protests off and where they're standing as of right now. Then I want to get into a little bit of the history of the US and CIA involvement in Iran that has kind of led or helped to usher in the current theocratic regime that is in power right now. So let's go ahead and get into some of the details here from Julia Conley. She says, US progressives express solidarity with Iranian protesters after the death of Mahsa Amini. So what are they talking about here? She says, progressive U.S. lawmakers on Friday expressed solidarity with anti-government protesters that have spread to cities across Iran as people express outrage over the death of a 22-year-old woman who was in police custody after being accused of violating the country's strict dress code. They say as authorities have cracked down on the protests, which are now taking place in more than 5 cities, more than 30 people have reportedly been killed and hundreds have been injured or arrested. They say the protests erupted this past week after the death of Mahsa Amini, a Kurdish Iranian woman. Important that she was Kurdish in this situation because I think that there is at least a little bit of an ethnic or racial component to her treatment by the morality police in Iran. But they say that she was killed on September 16th, and Amini had been in a coma for 3 days following her arrest in Tehran by the country's so-called morality police, and she had been accused of wearing improper head covering. They say a photo of Amini in a coma sparked outrage when it was circulated on social media, and her family has accused the police of beating Amini, rejecting a police report that she suffered a heart attack while in custody. I mean, this is some shit that like US police would be pulling, completely ridiculous idea here that some random like 22-year-old who is otherwise perfectly healthy as far as we know, just randomly suffered a heart attack as she just so happened to be in the custody of the Iranian morality police after being arrested and beaten by them for not wearing the headdressing that they had wanted her to. I mean, just a completely ridiculous line of excuses here from the Iranian government, obviously, but they continue here saying that protests condemning Amini's death have included women tearing off and burning their hijabs, which is punishable by arrest and fines, while men have cheered them on. So a lot of bravery going on by these protesters. I'll show you a little bit of what they're referring to here in terms of like women taking off their coverings and throwing them into the fire. So let's go ahead and watch this little clip here. All right, so, I mean, you absolutely love to see it, love the energy going on there, but, I mean, again, these people are showing a significant degree of bravery, considering that, the initial spark of these protests came because somebody was not wearing their initial, or the preferred head covering that the government wants them to be wearing, and now you have people who are taking to the streets and just openly taking them off and burning them in fires. So, again, incredible amount of bravery from the protesters who are actually participating in that. Now, I think that also ties in to an important point that needs to be made while we're discussing these protests, which is that, here in the United States, especially among conservatives, there tends to be this view of Middle Eastern countries that they are like entirely hegemonic and that everybody there is just backwards and they're all these, far-right theocrats who want to kill the United States of America and shit like that. It's just not true. I mean, there is incredible diversity within all of these various countries that you want to talk about, even in places like Saudi Arabia or otherwise, but especially in Iran, there is a, significant degree of nuance in terms of how people view things, especially when it comes to, social issues like these head coverings and the surrounding laws that are currently in place in Iran. So there's a lot of different nuanced political views, ideological views, religious views within this country, and I think that you can see that with the amount of people who are choosing to take to the streets, and either women who are taking off their hijabs and burning them, or men who are standing in solidarity with them as they do it and trying to protect them. So I mean, again, I think it's important to understand that, there's a significant degree of diversity in this country. So they continue here saying that, and I think this is very important context to get as well, that since the demonstrations began, participants have also decried the country's struggling economy. Iran's economy has been severely weakened by sanctions imposed by the United States and other countries in the global north. Now, important point here, because a lot of these sanctions that we have in place on Iran are in place because the Donald Trump administration unilaterally decided to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal with no justification whatsoever. Iran was fully in compliance with the deal as it was standing, and since he tried to pull out of that deal, they have basically been deploying these snapback sanctions and a lot of other ones as well to try to strangle Iran into submission. And the Biden administration obviously has continued in lockstep with what the previous Donald Trump administration's policy towards Iran was. So we have a lot of these sanctions in place that have significantly contributed to the hardships that average Iranian people are facing economically, and it's done absolutely nothing to benefit the United States economically or politically. I mean, we still have the Joe Biden administration who is going and cozying up to Saudi Arabia and Israel, forming a lot of these security agreements and trying to basically form an alliance to counter the power and influence of Iran in the region, and taking way more of a hawkish approach to this country than would otherwise be necessary or even effective from a geopolitical standpoint. I mean, you really had an opportunity there when Biden was taking office to do a revitalization of the Iran nuclear deal, to lift a lot of these sanctions, which are completely unjustifiable in any way, shape, or form. And so, I mean, I think there was a huge missed opportunity there from Joe Biden to aggressively push for that and to get some economic relief to the people who have been suffering in Iran as a result of our sanctions, right? Because obviously you can have many different problems with the government of Iran, but sanctions are just economic warfare. They are always going to be disproportionately hurting the most vulnerable people within these countries. They are never going to be necessarily effective in like actually deposing of the government or replacing them with somebody that would be more amenable to U.S. Multinational interests. So, I mean, obviously these sanctions have been contributing to, I think, a lot of the underlying sentiment to why people are so willing to go out and participate in some of these protests. But again, not to take away from obviously the other major factors that are playing into why these protests sparked off. But we have another statement here from Code Pink, who noted that U.S. sanctions on Iran's internet services have for years endangered and violated the rights of Iranians by forcing them to rely on state-run services which are easily monitored, censored, and blacked out. And apparently we just had Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, who was saying that they are somewhat loosening those restrictions on internet freedom. Of course, only the second that there appears to be some sense of destabilization that's taking place within Iran, but we also had a couple takes here from Bernie Sanders and AOC. Bernie had to say, the Iranian people, led by young women, are demonstrating for their freedom and for a better life. The government has responded by killing dozens of protesters. I call upon the Iranian government to address the needs of their citizens, not kill them. I think he's correct about that. AOC said, solidarity with the courageous women and allies in Iran protesting for their freedom. Mahsa Amini was senselessly murdered by the same patriarchal and autocratic forces repressing women across the world, and the right to choose belongs to all of us, from hijabs to reproductive care. And again, I think she's 100% right, and making a good point there in terms of tying in the theocratic regime of Iran and some of the policies they have there, oppressing or suppressing the rights of women within that country, as well as a lot of the repressive policies that we've seen here in the United States, specifically relating to like abortion and otherwise women's healthcare in this country. So I think she's 100% correct about that. We also had a take here from Iran's government, who said that this is basically an attempt for the U.S. To try to weaken their country. Now, this is not something that would be historically unprecedented, but at the same time, I don't think that these protests are like some CIA plot, right? I mean, this is an instance of obviously some backlash, some justified backlash to the theocratic policies that are being implemented and enforced within Iran, often in violent ways, as was the case with Mahsa Amini. Now, we also have this update where apparently the EU and the US are considering further sanctions on Iran over the protest crackdown. I think, again, sanctions are never going to be effective in actually addressing these issues. You are just going to make it more difficult for average people living in Iran. You're not going to actually significantly hurt the government figures that you have a problem with their policies. This would be an absolute disaster. If anything, we should be trying to work towards revitalizing the Iranian nuclear deal and relieving a lot of those sanctions that we have had on this country for years now. So that would be an absolute disaster. But with all of that being laid out there, now I want to get into some of the history of U.S. involvement in Iran, because as I was saying before, there is a lot of diversity of thought, of ideology, of religion within Iran. And so, it has not always been a country that has been ruled by an iron grip of theocratic autocrats, basically. And the CIA and the United States empire has had a direct role in formally deposing of a democratically elected left-wing government within Iran that was far more, open socially with, religious policies and things like that, and, helped to usher in the current government that is in place right now. So let's go ahead and get into some of this video here from Mehdi Hassan in The Intercept. Great breakdown on some of the history of this, as well as some of the U.S., even modern politicians being completely complicit and silent on this issue. So let's go ahead and watch a little bit of this video.
Ever since the revolution of 1979, US presidents have viewed the Islamic Republic of Iran, under the rule of the Ayatollahs, as a threat and as an enemy, and the feeling's pretty mutual.
Iran's leaders have shown only a clenched fist.
آمریکا و انگلیس رو نگاه بکنید. هر جا دیکتاتوری و ترور و آدمکشی است، دست اونها در کاره.
For decades, Iran has fueled the fires of sectarian conflict and terror.
Death to America, Khamenei told the audience, because America is the original source of this pressure.
I just want to say, absolutely amazing that somebody like Donald Trump would be saying that Iran's government is fueling the fire of global terrorism for two different reasons. Number one, Donald Trump is best friends with the Saudi Arabian government, and they are by far have much more of a disproportionate impact in terms of exporting terrorism around the region and around the world. That's number one. But also number two, you're talking about Donald Trump, somebody who literally, in complete violation of international law, assassinated Qasem Soleimani, somebody who was helping to fight actual radical jihadist militants with ISIS, and he just assassinated this top Iranian general and almost sparked off World War III. I mean, that was an act of terrorism. That was an act of violence against another, one close to the head of state in the Iranian government. And so for him to come out and just say that, oh, it's Iran that's destabilizing politics around the world, my guy, you are the biggest perpetrator of that. You literally tried to kill, or successfully killed, a top Iranian general and tried to spark off World War III with Iran. So I mean, come on, let's be real about this.
But what if it was blowback from US policies that helped the Ayatollahs take over in the first place? Americans often ask, why can't Iran have a secular democratic government? Well, they kinda did, and it was the US that helped get rid of that government and pave the way for the Ayatollahs and the Islamic Revolution. You have to go back to 1953 and the coup against Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who was democratically elected. A former Time magazine Man of the Year, the populist Mossadegh had a great deal of support from ordinary Iranians. He reduced the powers of the autocratic king, the Shah, and nationalized the Iranian oil industry.
That's the main issue, okay? That's the main issue that caused the United States and Britain to want to actually get involved to topple this democratically elected, somewhat left-wing government under Mohammad Mossadegh, okay? It was all about the oil, as it was in Iraq, as it was in, many other countries that the United States has been involved in, specifically within the Middle East, but also other countries as well. I mean, part of the reason why we have such sanctions on Venezuela, for example, is because they also had attempted to nationalize their oil industry, and the United States and our, a multinational corporate interest didn't like that. I mean, same exact thing applies here to Iran. It's just that when you're looking back from historical examples, they're a lot less covert about it and a lot more interest or open in terms of talking about their interests in the region. And so him deciding to nationalize their oil industry is obviously the main factor here in terms of why he ended up getting deposed by the CIA and the British government as well.
That upset the British, who had been in control of Iran's oil, and they decided to take action.
We should not allow the biggest foreign asset in Britain to go without doing something about it.
The sooner then that he left power, the better for Persia. Not for us, for Persia.
Right. So the British persuaded the Americans, in the form of the Eisenhower administration, to join them in getting rid of Mossadegh.
The British understood the extent of paranoia in this country concerning communism. This was the day of Joe McCarthy, and that the British consciously played on that fear in order to help persuade us to involve ourselves in the coup.
Mossadegh was not a communist, but he did have the support of the country's Communist Party. So the CIA, just 6 years old, swung into action. CIA agent Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, arrived in Tehran in July of 1953 to implement Operation Ajax. Thanks to declassified CIA documents, we now know the details of that plan included persuading the Shah to sign 2 decrees sacking Mossadegh and replacing him with a pro-American general, paying mobs of protesters to take to the streets and start anti-government riots, and funding a propaganda campaign to portray Mossadegh as a pro-Soviet communist.
That mob that came into North Tehran and was decisive in the overthrow was a mercenary mob, had no ideology, and that mob was paid for by American dollars.
By August, Mossadegh had been forced from office and the Shah was back in full control. "I owe my throne to God, my people, my army, and to you," the jubilant Shah told Roosevelt and the CIA, as he kicked off a 26-year period of brutal dictatorship, which would end up sparking the Islamic Revolution in 1979. By the way, none of this is disputed anymore. The Clinton administration fessed up in 2000.
The Eisenhower administration believed its actions were justified for strategic reasons, but the coup was clearly a setback for Iran's political development.
But even when US leaders openly admit to the US role in the Iranian coup, they try and play it down. Here's Barack Obama speaking in 2015.
We had some involvement with overthrowing a democratically elected regime in Iran.
Some involvement?
Okay, so I'm going to cut the video off there. I mean, I'll put it down in the description if you guys want to go watch the rest of it, but that was a great breakdown. And listen, I think this is important to bring this stuff up when we're talking about the current state of Iran's politics or even the geopolitics in the entire Middle East as a region. I mean, this is similar to like the US involvement in Afghanistan as well. I mean, you want to talk about what aided and abetted the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan? Well, the Taliban branched off from the Mujahideen fighters that the United States and the CIA was backing to go fight against the scary communist threat of the Soviet Union-backed government in Afghanistan. And you have a similar situation here in Iran, where essentially because Britain had significant stakes in Iranian oil production and profiting off of another country's resource, they decided to do the thing that imperialists love to do and go and use violent force and propaganda. And I mean, as they were pointing out in that video, literally hiring basically mercenary mobs to go do astroturfed protests, and ends up resulting in overthrowing the democratically elected government within this country, a government that was far less repressive in terms of a lot of the things that the current government is implementing with their theocratic laws that they have in place that inevitably led to the death of Mahsa Amini and the current protests that we are seeing right now. So, I mean, obviously you're going to have a lot of US politicians who are jumping on the bandwagon now and pretending as if they support freedom and democracy, and really their only interest in this equation is trying to destabilize one of their perceived political adversaries in Iran as much as possible. But that's not to take away any legitimacy whatsoever from these protests. I think that, again, the people who are participating in them, you are absolute legends, you are brave as fuck. And obviously these laws that they have in place, the morality police even existing as a concept, is completely fucking ridiculous. And you know, hopefully there is some like reforms that are able to be put in place like this in a moment like this. But again, you also have to take into consideration a lot of those historical aspects to this, which is that, you know, in a lot of these countries that the United States likes to come out and call, you know, these terrible authoritarian regimes, well, you know, how did they get like this? I mean, the United States had a direct role in facilitating the overthrow of a democratically elected government and then funding a lot of the groups that became the theocratic regime in Iran that we know today. And so, you know, you got to understand that there's always been a lot of diversity in thought. There's always been a lot of diversity in, you know, philosophy and religion and ethnicities within all of these various countries. And it's been the United States empire, as well as Britain and other Western European countries, that have exploited a lot of ethnic divisions and, you know, used that tension for our own economic benefit. And I think that that's important to lay out here in terms of giving an analysis of how we ended up to this position in the first place. So again, nothing but solidarity to the people participating in these protests. Hopefully it does result in some serious reforms to their laws, or maybe even the abolishment of their stupid fucking morality police that they have in place over there. But at the end of the day, again, the United States still has a role to play in this right the fuck now. We should be giving sanctions relief to Iran. It's completely unjustified. Again, these were sanctions that were put in place after Donald Trump decided to unilaterally pull out of the Iran nuclear deal for no justified reason whatsoever. Iran was fully in compliance with that deal, and the Joe Biden administration has an opportunity right now to actually try to build more of a coalition and more of a relationship with Iran, try to revitalize the Iran nuclear deal, give them sanctions relief, and then you could actually maybe have more of a stable platform to talk about trying to aid the process of improving humanitarian conditions within this country.
Everyone is saying good politics guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me. Everyone is saying